Hello, my name is Emily, and this is my March wrap-up. I really kicked it up a notch last month, and I read 14 books. People have been like, wow, you've been reading so many books. Really, my secret is, at the start of a workday, I plug in an audiobook and I listen to it on 1.75 speed. And that's pretty much an audiobook done in like 2 days. Other people might wonder why I'm listening to books on 1.75 speed instead of committing to the 2 times speed. And I just really can't handle 2 times speed. I tried it once. I can't really handle it. So 1.75 is the most comfortable speed for me. But we are digressing. We are talking about the books that I read in March. Overall, I had a pretty good reading month in March. I had 2 readathons going on and I enjoyed both of those. So let's get right to the books that I read in March. The first book I read was Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. So basically this is a book with 6 interlinked narratives. They're all related in some way. I'm not going to talk much more about it just in case you want to read this yourself and actually want to uncover it on your own. But I thought this was really cool and clever, and picking up on all the details and clues was great. It definitely reminded me a lot of Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. That book is also made up of a lot of interlinked narratives. What was also amazing to me was that all of these voices were so distinct because they're all of their own time and place. You have a man in the 1800s and you have a Korean woman in the future. So they all are very distinct even though they are related to each other in a very subtle way. And even in the futuristic narratives, there's even some world building involved that's actually quite impressive. I will say that at times certain narratives slowed me down because I actually needed to slow down and actually pick up on what they were saying, because the first narrative, which takes place in the 1800s, was spoken in this written in this very antiquated voice. And then there's the middle, which is written in this really futuristic vernacular where a lot of things are really abbreviated, spellings are changed. So I had to slow down in order to really understand what was going on. So that middle section took me the longest to read. But apart from that, I really enjoyed this book. I was really engaged with each narrative and I felt like I experienced a whole different novel in each section almost. So I do highly recommend this book. There is really nothing like this book. It's very unique. It was an excellent read. I just really liked it. I gave it 5 stars. Next up is Kushiel's Dark by Jacqueline Carey. This book takes place in a medieval fantasy France. So the concept of this novel is that we're basically in Europe. All the other countries are basically their own countries. Like Spain is basically Spain, but it's called something else. It's called Aragonia, and France is called Terre d'Ange, or Land of Angels. And to the east of Terre d'Ange, we have Skaldia, which is basically a amalgamation of Germanic and Norse peoples. But Terre d'Ange, or France, basically worships angels. So their national mythology is basically that a group of rebellious angels settled in the country and now they worship those angels. Now the main character is Phaedra and she is training to be a spy and courtesan, and she's considered unique because she has a red dot in one of her pupils, and that is called a Kushiel's dart. This marks her as a so-called angissette, or someone who enjoys pain or takes pleasure from pain. So this story follows a lot of her experiences from her childhood to her training and eventually getting involved in a lot of really complicated plots against the crown. I actually really enjoyed this book. I wasn't sure what to expect because some people love it, but then some other people have read it and have been like, ooh, I don't know about this. But I thought the world was really engaging. It was very lush. I also thought it was a really interesting take on sex work. One of the angels, called Nama, is renowned for having sold her body to different people in order to support her angelic siblings while they were trying to survive in this new country at first. So now being a courtesan is considered almost a divine service because you are giving up yourself in order to serve others. So I thought that was a really interesting take on sex work and how it can be seen as this service rather than as this source of stigma. And I loved seeing Phaedra grow and become more resourceful as a character as she starts to face some hardship. I mean, she starts out being very carefree and taking pleasure from her given profession, but then over time she really starts to see the impact of the service and also really come to terms with how complicated politics can be and how dangerous it can be if you know too much. The one thing I would say about this book is that it does portray the Germanic and Norse peoples as being super barbaric, and Phaedra always has such contempt for that people's way of life. And to an extent I don't blame her, and if you read the book you'll know why, because she has good reason to think so. But also I'm a little bit tired of Vikings slash Norse people as being portrayed as these like rough people with hardly any culture. I feel like there's a lot more nuance in Norse culture than people make it out in fiction. So I wasn't sure how I felt about that. I was a little iffy about it, and it felt just a bit xenophobic. But it also felt like people in Terre d'Ange are like that anyway. They're just like, we're the most beautiful and most sophisticated people, and that's that. So I really did enjoy this book. I believe I gave it 4.5 stars on Goodreads. I will probably read the next book. I thought it was fascinating, and there's some great intrigue set up for the next volumes. The next book I read was A Shadow Bright and Burning by Jessica Cluess. So in this book we have our main character Henrietta Howl, who is trying to hide that she has magical powers, but then they are discovered and she is recruited to become a sorcerer. This is set in Victorian England, and in this alternative Victorian England there are eldritch creatures coming through from another world and attacking the people. We also have 3 different magical users. So we have witches, magicians, and sorcerers. And as of now, sorcerers are the only legal magical users, and Henrietta is recruited to join their ranks. So in the beginning, I was a little bit caught about whether I liked this book or not, and whether I thought it was original or not, because there is kind of a twist on the chosen one trope. But I ended up really enjoying it. I actually enjoyed the aspects of the magic system that I witnessed. I thought Henrietta was fine. I know she has several potential love interests. The one I like best is Blackwood. If you read the book, you'll know why. I like that he doesn't immediately fawn all over her like all the other characters do. I mean, from the beginning, he's always been like, you need to earn my respect. And I was like, you know what? I respect that. I would be interested in future books to see how the magical hierarchy actually works, because in this world, as far as we know, witches are like down here, and then magicians are here, and sorcerers are here. And I'm wondering if that magical hierarchy is actually a thing, or if this is just a construct that sorcerers have set down. I have the feeling that it's the latter. And I had my own perspective going into this because, so if you haven't picked it up by now, based on the books that I've been reading and stuff I've been saying and jewelry I've been wearing in literally every video, I am a practicing witch. And being a witch, I've seen that there's kind of a artificial hierarchy of magic, because you have your sort of high magic and then your low magic, and some magic is considered superior to others. And so I thought that was interesting. I mean, frankly, I want to see more magicians, because the magicians were shown to be fascinating. They can just do all kinds of stuff and manipulate their universe in all these different ways. The sorcerers, to me, frankly, are kind of dull. They don't do that much, if you ask me. There's not huge variety to their abilities, so I want to see more of those distinctions of abilities that each of these classes have. And of course, we haven't seen what witches do at all, so I want more witches in the next book. Another thing I did like was that the sorcerers have all the elements corresponding to the correct directions, because in witchcraft we have the ideas of the elements: air, water, fire, and earth, and how they correspond to the different directions: north, south, east, west. And in the beginning, when Henrietta is being tested in her powers, there is a different object representing each element and placed in a certain direction, and I realized that they were actually set up in the correct direction, so I liked that detail. One thing I would have liked in this book was to be more anchored in the time period we're talking about, because when I went into this book, I envisioned that we were in, say, the 1870s, 1880s. I thought we were in the late 1800s, so that would mean Queen Victoria is old and we are in a certain state of fashion. But then someone says in the book, oh, well, the Queen's really young and naive and easily movable. I'm like, oh, whoa, so we're talking more like late 1830s, early 1840s, so that means fashion is different, politics are different. When you tell me that something is set in the Victorian era, I'm like, when in the Victorian era? It's so long. So much happens in that time, so much develops, and also so much in fashion changes over that time. You need to be more specific. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I really enjoyed that about the book because we had a sense of the year and what would be politically going on and how that alternative world diverges from the real world. And I would have liked more of that in this book. But that is just me. I am a huge fan of the Victorian era and its history, so I'm just nitpicky like that. But overall, I did really like A Shadow Bright and Burning. I am really looking forward to reading the next book. Next up is The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. This is based on Slavic folklore. I think it's set in medieval Russia, actually. This came highly recommended by Reagan from Peruse Project and Sam from Thoughts on Tomes, so I was really looking forward to this book. This is about a girl called Vasya whose mother dies in childbirth. And eventually her father brings home a very paranoid stepmother who's very devout. Vasya also has the ability to see different household and nature spirits, which are pretty important in Russian folklore. So she grows up wanting to preserve their way of life and wanting to honor them. But her stepmother is very devout and can also see these creatures, but sees them as demons. And she's very religious, so she makes things really hard for Vasya. So a lot of this book is centered around this conflict between old traditional beliefs and spirits and divinities and this new Christian religion and all the paranoias that come with it. A lot of people have said this before, but I really loved how this book was real to the actual mindset of the time. If a woman transgressed in a certain way, she would have certain consequences. So even though this book clearly had a progressive point of view, I thought that it wasn't out of place for the time. I thought what happened was very real to that time, and it just felt very anchored in place. The world just felt very real and tangible. So I really enjoyed this book. I am also looking forward to reading the next book. I gave this 5 stars on Goodreads. Also, I haven't really been talking about the readathons I've been participating in last month. Kushiel's Dart and A Shadow Bright and Burning I read for Femme Fatale. The Bear and the Nightingale was the first book that I read for the Witchathon. So the next book I read for Witchathon was Every Heart a Doorway. This is by Shannon McGuire. This is a novella about children who have been portaled off to different worlds when they were younger and they have now come back, and they have been brought to this school to rehabilitate, essentially. So their parents think that they are going to the school to correct this so-called fantasy that they have, when in fact they are being more rehabilitated and all of their experiences are being validated. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars, but I wanted more, I think, because we only got little glimpses of all these different portal worlds. I thought that system of different portal worlds and where they belong on these different axes was fascinating, and I enjoyed the characters a lot, but I definitely wanted more. But also I understand why there wasn't, because we have so many different experiences to choose from, and we were just kind of looking at a slice of that. So I kind of get why. I still really enjoyed this. Next book I read was Hellblazer Volume 2, The Devil You Know. So I liked the beginning of this book a lot. So if you don't know, Hellblazer is about a magician called John Constantine. Constantine is basically this really snarky British man who smokes and drinks a ton. He's also very morally ambiguous. So we were dealing with his conflict from the previous volume, and there was a lot of resolution to that. We brought back a character that I liked, but then I thought was gone in the first volume, but then we got to have him back for a bit. But now he's gone again, so I don't know, maybe he's gonna reappear in the future. Then we came to the middle 2 issues, which I enjoyed somewhat less. I found the artwork and the text really cluttered. There was a lot going on in the art and a lot going on in the text, so I was trying to pick up stuff from the pictures and also pick up stuff from the text, and there was just an overload of information, and I found that a little bit frustrating to read, even though the narrative was pretty fascinating. The end issue or story was actually pretty good. It had a really nice allegory for reliving trauma wherever you go and eventually taking that out on other people around you. I thought that analogy was great. So I gave this a 3.75 4 stars on on Goodreads. It wasn't quite amazing, but I thought individual issues were actually really good. One thing I will say about Hellblazer is that sometimes the politics of the writer Jamie Delano are pretty blatant. He was already pretty blatant about the fact that he doesn't like Margaret Thatcher. Like, the last book was full of skinheads being racist and homophobic. But in this volume, we have Constantine kicking over a TV when he finds out that the Tories have won. And I'm just like, I get it, you don't like Margaret Thatcher. Like, let's move on. Next up was the group read for Witchathon, and it was the Black God's Drums. This takes place in an alternative American South where the South won in the Civil War and managed to secede successfully. This book takes place specifically in New Orleans, which is considered neutral territory. This world takes place about 20 years after the Civil War, so it's the 1880s, but the world is very steampunky. The main character is sort of a street urchin who uncovers a plot to steal this weapon called the Black God's Drums, and the Orisha play a big part in the conflict. I think the world building of this story was a bit more interesting than the main narrative, because you had all kinds of magic going on, and then you also had white supremacists trying to appropriate this weapon, and you also have airships and then police who walk around in vehicles that look like bugs and they have multiple legs. But I did enjoy this. I gave this 3.5 stars. Next up we have Scythe by Neil Shusterman. So this is an incredibly popular series. This is about a futuristic world in which humankind has eradicated death. Humans can cure all diseases and all manners of injury, but in order to control the world population, there are scythes which are employed to cull the human population. So the two main characters are Citra and Rowan, and they are recruited to become scythes, and the story follows their training process. During the story, we also see them encountering different figures in the scythedom and having to deal with a lot of the politics of that organization. I won't give away too much of the story, but I did really enjoy this. I gave this 4 stars. I found the side characters really interesting, actually. We got to see excerpts of their diaries throughout the novel, and it gave us some extra insight into the world building and how this world developed and came to be what it is now. And the side characters overall were really well developed, except for the primary antagonist of the novel. And that's my main complaint about this novel, is that there's not a lot of moral ambiguity in the story. I felt like we were being presented with this binary, like these are the good sides and these are the bad and corrupt ones. But when you're in an organization like that that's beset with a lot of politics, a lot of this good and bad binary, it just doesn't really apply. And we also got to read some diary entries from the perspective of the primary antagonist, but I didn't feel like they added any depth to him or any ambiguity. I felt like we never really got to understand his real intention or how he developed his own moral code, and I felt that would have made the story a lot more interesting than it was. I also found that the side characters were a lot more interesting than our main characters, Citra and Rowan. They basically meet when they're recruited for apprenticeship, and that's the beginning of their relationship. They become friendly and they train alongside each other, but I feel like that doesn't really justify the romance that develops between them, because they go through a lot of lengths to save one another, and I just felt like you guys kind of trained next to each other, but you didn't have any really strong relationship from the start. So when they go out of their way to protect each other and help each other, it just felt like, wow, this is the power of boners. If they were longtime friends before the story started, then maybe I would have bought into this romance. But still, really enjoyable read. Next up, I read Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. This was just sort of hanging around in my Audible library. I kind of realized that I hadn't read a lot of Diana Wynne Jones, even though she was a childhood literary staple of sorts. And Howl's Moving Castle is supposed to be a classic, and of course it was turned into a famous Miyazaki film. So basically this book is about a girl called Sophie, and she is training to be a hat maker when one day she displeases a witch. And so she's turned into an old lady, so she seeks out this wizard called Howl, who is very infamous in the area, and she seeks him out in hopes that he will be able to help her reverse this curse. In the process, she becomes his cleaning lady and gets to interact with other people who are working for him, like this fire demon. So this was a really quirky and charming read. I liked the world that was set up, and I think at some point we get introduced to the real world, so our world, and that was a little bit jarring, but there's not much to say about it. I liked the fairy tale atmosphere. I liked the magic that we were presented with. I liked Howl, but at times I found him annoying, and frankly, I'm not that crazy about about him, even though he is kind of an interesting character. He's kind of that person who escaped into his own magical world to avoid real world responsibilities. Like, that is literally his character. I gave this 3.75-ish stars on Goodreads as well. It was fine. Okay, so next I read Hunting Prince Dracula by Kerri Maniscalco. This was the sequel to Stalking Jack the Ripper, which I have reviewed on this channel, and if you've watched that review, you know my thoughts about it. So Stalking Jack the Ripper, not great for historical accuracy, not great for having a very compelling heroine or love interest, not a great representation of the Jack the Ripper murders or the investigation. But as I said in my video review, I did suspect a more fantastical plot might fit Kerri Maniscalco's writing style better, and it seems I was somewhat correct. This was a better book, in my opinion. That's not saying very much, but it was better. It's weird because I did not like Thomas Cresswell one bit in the last book, but in this book he's improved. I liked him better. He has more dimensions to him now. He's not insufferable. And my favorite part is now the romance. I don't know what's happening. I did not like their romance in the last book, but somehow for me this was the best part of the book this time round. But aside from that, there was more mystery and clue finding, which I thought was lacking in the last book. There was more figuring out of riddles and putting things together. That being said, it's really hilarious reading the author's note at the end, because then you basically realize that Kerri Maniscalco, even though she realizes certain things are anachronistic, just wants to put them in anyway, but not just for one thing, but multiple things as well. The Orient Express, she had to have it in the beginning of the book. This isn't really a spoiler, this is at the beginning of the book. And she says in the author's note, oh, well, this is like a few years too early to actually be in this book, but you know, I just couldn't help it. I put it in there anyway. But this goes on and on. There's a whole thing about a couple royal families, royal bloodlines, and she's like, well, there's no evidence for this being a thing or this family doing this, but I put it in anyway. There's no evidence for this castle being used in this way, but I did it anyway. And it's just, another nitpick that I have, which could be big or small depending on what your perspective is and what you're trying to get out of this book. Basically, Audrey Rose and Thomas Cresswell are at a forensic school in Romania in this castle. So this story takes place in Romania in Eastern Europe. The thing is, in 1880s, 1890s Europe, German was pretty much the lingua franca in that part of the world. So even if Romanians, like local Romanians, spoke Romanian, I would have thought a place like a big school like this would be taught in German, because German was one of the major elite languages of that time. So of course, schools in that part of the world would have been predominantly taught in German. In fact, they're training in forensics, so they're trying to be scientists, and to be a scientist at that time, German and speaking in German and writing in German, that was pretty much a prerequisite. So props to Kerri Maniscalco for researching Romanian names and places and words and phrases to slip into her novel. But to me, I would have been more impressed if the students had to learn Romanian to speak with the locals, but then learn German to communicate with their teachers, because that was the language in that area. So, you know, Audrey Rose is frantically trying to learn Romanian while she's traveling to Romania with Cresswell, but I was like, shouldn't you be learning German? So that was a nitpick from me. You might not care about this at all, but I'm a history buff and I'm also a linguist to boot, so I care about accuracies like these. But anyway, I gave this 3 stars. I was not expecting that much out of it, and I managed to have some fun with it. Because of the setting and the nature of the story, I was able to suspend my disbelief a bit. But now I'm kind of uncertain about whether I want to move on to the next books or not, because I know it's going to be more of this. The next book I read is Wolf by Wolf by Ryan Groudon. This is about an alternative world where the Nazis and the Japanese won World War II, and now Japan and Nazi Germany are kind of locked in a Cold War of sorts. They have essentially split the world between them. If you've watched The Man in the High Castle, you know this is not an original concept, but there's a different sci-fi twist in this world. So our main character is Yael, who is a girl who survived the concentration camps, and she was the product of a set of really intense and damaging scientific experiments by one of the camp doctors. But the result of this is that she can shapeshift into different people. And after Yael escapes the concentration camps, she joins joins the Resistance, and the Resistance gives her the mission to compete in a long motorcycle race across the world. Editing Emily here, I forgot to mention while summarizing this book, Yael's mission is so that she can win the race and get close to Hitler and assassinate him. Kind of important to the mission. I'm not sure why I forgot this important detail. Anyway, back to filming me. To do this, she has to impersonate the previous winner of this race, and she has to compete against other physically superior youths, primarily from Japan and Germany. And it turns out two of the people she's racing against intimately know the person that she is impersonating. And so the story follows her trying to fulfill her mission while trying to not compromise her identity. So this was a really fascinating read. I loved how the shape-shifting motif was used to explore how something like the Holocaust not only dehumanized people, but also erased their identities so that they just became one among many people who died. And throughout the story, Yael is always trying to figure out what her identity really is because she has essentially lost her true face. So she's always coming to grips about who she really is. So the narrative is interspersed with a lot of flashbacks. We have her in the race, but we also get flashbacks to her in the concentration camps, joining the Resistance. And I was really interested in the flashbacks to her time in the concentration camp, discovering her new powers, interacting with people at the camps, dealing with the really dehumanizing process of being experimented on. And I was also really interested in how she joined the Resistance and interacted with the different individuals that she encounters. So that stuff was really interesting, but then a lot of portions of the race and going through the race and competing with other people in the race, like some of that stuff just really dragged for me and wasn't as interesting. But then at the end, there is a huge twist and it's really exciting and fast-paced. I also gave this 4 stars on Goodreads. I do highly recommend it as speculative fiction. Next up, I read The Force Doth Awaken by Ian Desher, which is part of his William Shakespeare Star Wars series. I had it on audiobook and I just needed a quick read at the time. This was the Shakespeareification of The Force Awakens. So it turns out that Shakespeare verses can make a movie better. That's not saying very much because I don't really care for the sequel trilogy in general, and I frankly don't want to recognize the sequel trilogy as canon, and it was really fun for me to read even if I didn't enjoy the original film that much. I think it would have helped if I remembered more of what happened in The Force Awakens because then I would have been able to follow the sequence of events a bit better in this book. But then again, The Force Awakens is a really forgettable film, so what are you gonna do? So I had a lot of fun listening to this on audiobook. It plays out like a radio drama. There's sound effects and they found a lot of voice actors who sound a lot like the original characters. But also listening to this book, I think this emphasizes how much of a Mary Sue Rey is. Like there's so many situations where Rey fixes something and she says, "I have fixed it." And then other characters are like, "Amazing, how have you done such a thing?" And it happens like 5 or 6 times. And after a while, it just really pissed me off. Definitely Kylo Ren is my favorite part of this book and of the sequel trilogy. At one point, he calls the stormtroopers foolish, idle-headed canker blossoms, which is the best. Also, Ian Desher has Han Solo just make a Hamilton joke randomly. Like literally, there's just a line lifted from Hamilton there, and I'm like, whoa, this is random. Where did this come from? But if you do read this book, I highly recommend reading Ian Desher's author's note at the end. He talks a lot about some of the Easter eggs that he slips into people's lines. Like Rey's lines apparently reference all of the fan theories around her parentage. So it was really clever and cute. I enjoyed it. I definitely didn't like this as much as the books for the original trilogy, but that's just a function of me not liking The Force Awakens as much. But it was still great to listen to anyway. I'm actually looking to read the books for the prequel films right now. I've been looking for them online in physical copy, and for the life of me, I can't find the one for Revenge of the Sith. I don't know why this is. Somehow it's just not available anywhere. If you know something about this, let me know. Also, I feel like this video is really long now. Next up, I read Swing Time by Zadie Smith. This book is about a girl who really wants to be a dancer, and when she's very young, she makes friends with a girl who is a dancing prodigy. But while the main character, who has no name, can't continue to dance because she has flat feet, her friend goes on to be very successful. And so these two girls drift apart. The narrator eventually ends up working as a personal assistant for a mega pop star, and she intermittently meets up with her dancer friend. This book is kind of odd because the blurb for the book would suggest that the book is about their friendship, and to an extent it is kind of about their friendship. It's kind of about a really complicated friendship, but also the story is really focused on this nameless protagonist. So it's really about this person who has this really complicated relationship that plays out a lot in her life. So this book is not very plot driven. None of Zadie Smith's books really are. It was such a gift to read her prose again and realize what a beautiful writer she is. She really just does have beautiful prose. Like, no one does it like her. I will say that this book was more fun to listen to than to read. I actually read this on a combination of audiobook and ebook, and when I switched to ebook, I was like, oh my god, these paragraphs are 2 pages long. I'm switching back to audiobook. And I think this time round I realized maybe some of the flaws of Zadie Smith's writing, and they're not terrible enough to make me stop reading her books, but I think I realized this time what she could do better. Zadie Smith tends to go on and on about stuff, and it's great and it's beautiful writing, and but it does ramble a bit when sometimes I feel like she should be more concise. There are times in the novel where the narrator is not dealing with her friend and she is working for this pop star and following her along to Africa where her employer wants to build a school. And those sections were fine, I didn't hate them, but they just weren't as interesting. And I just kind of wanted the protagonist to get to the point of what she was trying to say about that experience, because for a time I wasn't even sure what the point was. Because the main character's mother and her friend are such interesting, compelling characters. I was just like, can you get us out of Africa and bring us back to London where we can interact with these really interesting people? That being said, I think those sections deal with something that I guess Zadie Smith really wanted to talk about, which is how mindless people with too much money can be. Like, they throw their money at a problem, but then they don't look close enough to actually understand an issue because they're so far removed because of their privilege. And there's also some really interesting commentary about friendship and race and marriages as well. It's also really evidence that film and media and arts and culture had a big impact on Zadie Smith when she was growing up, because she constantly references these things. But my problem with this is that she seems to be talking about them more from an academic perspective rather than as someone who loves these things. Like, this book is so much about dance, but I'm not sure I get the sense that Zadie Smith loves dance. This was also a point that was brought up by someone I saw on Goodreads. So I was interested in the characters more than the dance aspect of their characters. So I was interested in their characters, but I kind of zoned out a bit when it showed that they were dancing, because I was like, I'm not really getting the love for dancing through this prose. That being said, I gave this 4 stars. I still really enjoyed listening to it. Zadie Smith's writing is absolutely beautiful as always, but I do not suggest starting on this book if you want to get into her writing. I would start with something more like White Teeth or On Beauty. Those are very good books. And finally, in March, I finished The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. So I started this during Witchathon, but I only managed to finish it at the 11th hour on March 31st. It's really odd with this book because I feel like I almost couldn't read this during the daytime. I almost exclusively had to read this when I was in bed under the covers with a nightlight on. It was almost like I had to be close to a dream state to read this. And maybe that's just the nature of this book, I'm not sure. So this book is about a grad student called Zachary who's studying media. And when he's doing research for his topic, he finds a mysterious book in his university library. And it's a book full of short stories, and one of them is about him. So he's trying to uncover the mystery of this book, and he digs deeper and deeper. And this eventually leads him on a quest to a mysterious location, perhaps a library underground. So this book was literally like reading a fever dream. It was like the best bedtime story ever. So Erin Morgenstern is known for her very lyrical language and like really excellent purple prose. I loved the atmosphere, most amazing atmosphere ever. But this is also a story with a lot of stories in it. It's kind of like Cloud Atlas actually, and I was kind of already used to this story format because of Cloud Atlas. But basically we get a lot of stories that don't seem related but actually are all related, and it was really cool to kind of flip back to the different stories and see different elements and how they were relating to the current events. And we're following this character called Zachary, but I would argue he's not really the most interesting part of the story, and that was probably the point, because really we're just learning about this place and about stories and about how choices lead you to different places. And also it talks a bit about the nature of stories and how they influence us and how they can be very interactive. I don't think my thoughts on this book are quite finished, but I did really enjoy this. I gave this 4.5 stars. But yeah, this was trippy and weird, and I loved it, and I do recommend it if you enjoy Erin Morgenstern's writing. So that's it for my March wrap-up. I feel like this video is redonkulously long, but let me know down below what books you read in the month of March, and if you have read any of the books I've named in this video. Like this video if you liked it, and remember to subscribe to my channel if you like my content. You can follow me on Twitter, Goodreads, and Instagram. Stay safe and healthy, everyone, and I will see you in my next video.